All right, this is our first episode of Theology Thursday from the Fellowship of Christian Athletes and Connection Church in Danville. Are bringing this to you. And on the podcast today, I have Dr. Donny Mathis. Dr. Donny Mathis has his MDiv and PhD, both from Southern Seminary, the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky.
That's right. You need to get that right. That's right.
And if everybody can see Rupp Arena in the background there, Dr. Mathis is a huge Kentucky fan. He's from Kentucky, obviously.
Did my undergraduate at UK also.
That's right. You did your undergraduate. And you did it in engineering, right? Or math?
Mechanical engineering. That's right.
Yeah. He is a director of the Center for Faculty Excellence at North Greenville University. He is an elder at the church at Cherrydale there in Greenville, South Carolina. He's married to Amber and has two kids, Trace and Hallie. Donny has co-authored the book 7 Arrows with Matt Rogers, which is a great, I'm going to plug that real quick. It's a great practical resource for how to read, interpret, and apply Scripture. Matt was the general editor, and Donny was the New Testament editor for the 7 Arrows Study Bible, which takes passages from the Christian Standard, I think you said, the Holman Christian Standard.
That's in the Christian Standard Bible, yeah.
Yeah, Christian Standard Bible, and walks you through the 7 arrows in some of those passages. So I'm delighted to have Dr. Mathis on for our first guest. Dr. Mathis was actually one of my profs at North Greenville, where I graduated. It's been a decade this May, which is crazy. But thoroughly enjoyed my time there. And Dr. Mathis and all the other guys there in the Christian Studies department were huge in that regard to making my experience there phenomenal. So welcome, Dr. Mathis.
Glad to be here.
Awesome. So one of my goals in Theology Thursday is to really get the best of practical theology, of biblical theology, of systematic theology, and maybe at some point we'll kind of walk through those definitions later on in another episode, but really to connect our brains being renewed in our minds, which is Romans 12:1, by thinking well about the faith, and then how do we live that out? How do we take theology and make it accessible to folks so they can walk out their faith in a way that honors God and honors His Word? And so today on this podcast, we're going to be exploring particularly the narrative in the book of Luke, in the Gospel of Luke, where as we're approaching Palm Sunday here in a few weeks, we're approaching Easter, it's coming on quickly. Wanted to take this time to really think about and have a conversation with Dr. Mathis about how do we think about Jesus' passion, his conversations with the Jewish leaders, all the things that are happening in that storm cloud that grows right before he goes to Jerusalem. And so I'm going to what I would like for you, Dr. Mathis, if you could you just give us, as you think about when we approach Palm Sunday, as we approach Easter, just talk a little bit about the significance of what the Passion narrative really is for our faith.
Well, it's at the heart of our faith. Everything hinges on this last week of Jesus' life. As we build up in that last week to the point where Jesus is betrayed and he dies in the place of sinners. You know, if you look at the way that it's conveyed in each of the Gospels, they're each unique. This is one of the interesting and really beautiful things about what God did in inspiring the various authors to write is they're all telling the same story. They're telling it historically in an historically accurate fashion, and they're all telling it differently. Now, one of the things that can sometimes happen if folks approach the New Testament from a place of suspicion or doubt is that they would try to exploit some of these differences in telling to try to undermine the truthfulness of what's being said. Like if you were to turn on the History Channel, everybody's cooped up these days with quarantines and things like that. Like you turn on the History Channel and they're going to try to exploit those types of things to undermine the truthfulness of what's being described. But I think that one of the things that would be really helpful for us as we come to this time of year and as we look at each of the unique tellings of the story with their similarities and with their differences is that if we approach them from a place of empathy and consider each one of them on their own and think about the fact that you have these authors who have a theological perspective and are trying to teach particular people important things, that's why you're going to see things framed uniquely, various things emphasized differently, because they're writing to audiences. They're conveying this not just for sort of bare history or just kind of like Joe Friday on Dragnet, like just the facts. Like this is shaped for a purpose that doesn't undermine the truthfulness of what they're saying. In fact, I think if you look at it from one perspective, the fact that you have in this very important, significant literature, these differences kind of, I think, in some ways would lead us to recognize, particularly with the resurrection narratives, the truthfulness of what we have, because it's not like a group of people got together and they said, let's get our story straight to perpetuate a lie. They're telling it from different perspectives, emphasizing different things. And so in each of them, in various ways, the authors are going to demonstrate that when Jesus goes to the cross, he's dying in the place of sinners. So Luke brings it out really directly with the case of Barabbas. He's going to set, and you see it as well in Matthew and Mark, I think maybe a little more directly in Luke, that Barabbas and Jesus are set up as Jesus is innocent, Barabbas is guilty. No one doubts that Barabbas is guilty, and Luke is going to go out of his way in a way that is different, honestly, than Matthew and Mark and John, but particularly Matthew and Mark, to emphasize the fact that Jesus is innocent of everything that is taking place. And so there's this reality of unjust suffering that he's enduring, that then he's going to die very literally in the place of Barabbas. And then along with that, in the Gospel of John, you've got in leading up to the death of Jesus in chapter 11, chapter 12, the Sanhedrin is gathered together, and Caiaphas, who is the high priest at this particular point, is going to say that it's better for one man to die than for the whole nation to perish. And so John's going to bring out this fact that Jesus is dying in the place of his people. And so then along with that, you're going to see then the resurrection narratives, and each of the Gospels is going to frame those differently because they have different goals in what they're doing. And you're going to have the resurrection narratives that are pointing to the fact that Jesus has physically, bodily been raised from the dead. And Luke goes out of his way as we dig into the Lucan narrative. Luke is going to make it very clear that this, particularly for a Gentile audience that might think that resurrection or life after death is purely a sort of spiritual, non-physical, ghost-like state, which is what you would find in Greco-Roman writings like in Homer and places like that it's not that there's a physical bodily existence, like Luke goes out of his way to say that Jesus, in a pretty famous way in various Gospels, Jesus is going to ask them to look at his hands and feet, that his death has, even in this resurrected body, has left the marks of the death. And then he says that he ate fish with them. And ghosts don't eat fish. Like,
That's right.
I remember when I was a kid and Ghostbusters came out and the ghost poured the whole plate of sausages into its mouth. It just went right through him. Well, that's not happening with Jesus. He's physically, bodily been raised. Now things are different because he also disappears.
Right.
Kind of cool.
Yeah.
But they're all told differently for different purposes. And I think that is, in the end, if you're looking from a place of empathy, that this could point to the fact that this really did happen, because they haven't told it in exactly the same way. It's not like, with your children or with your athletes on your team, when they get into trouble, they get together, they get their story straight, they tell it all exactly the same way, which is a good sign that they're lying to you. These are all different. Right. It starts with women who wouldn't really even be allowed to testify in court as being the main witnesses. And Luke even brings out that by and large, when they came and said the tomb is empty, we met these men in dazzling clothes, and they still didn't believe.
Right.
I mean, Peter goes to the tomb. He's the only one in Luke's gospel. He emphasizes Peter, probably to set up for the book of Acts in some ways. So there are folks like us who are shocked and crushed by this thing. They're, we can probably identify they're holed up in the upper room. They're hiding, they're afraid. Right. And then he shows up alive, right, and it changes everything. And one of the things I think that before we, dig into some more specifics, that I think is really interesting that with Luke and Acts together, that we can see is that, think about the picture that we see as we sort of walk through this of the disciples in the last week of Jesus' life. They're, particularly as they get to the arrest, they're fearful, they're afraid, and they scatter. And we have the classic description of that with Peter's denial of Jesus 3 times, and his fear of a servant girl and the people that are there in the courtyard of the high priest. And then we sort of jump forward into the second chapter of the book of Acts. And now that the Spirit has come, he stands up and preaches at Pentecost. 3,000 people are saved. Then in chapter 3, they go to the temple and the man is healed. And this leads to the first conflict with the religious leaders in chapter 4. And then they're arrested in the middle of proclaiming the message at the beginning of chapter 4, before they get to conclude and call people to be saved. And you've got thousands that are saved. You can really read that as 5,000 more or 2,000 more, but regardless, is a lot of people converted, even as the preacher is drug off to jail. And then in chapters 4 and 5, we get Peter and John arrested, then all the disciples arrested, and we see this boldness that they have. The very same guy who just a little bit earlier had been afraid of a servant girl and other random people stands before the Sanhedrin in maybe the very same place where Jesus was. We don't know if it was the same courtroom setting, but it's the same group of people. And this is in the span of 2 months, roughly, maybe a little more than that. He goes from denying Jesus to saying, whether it's right in the sight of God to do what you say or what God says, we're going to do what God says. And whatever you do to us, we're going to proclaim that salvation is not found in anyone other than Jesus, that he is the deliverer of Israel. He is the Savior that the prophets had talked about. And we're going to keep preaching it. You can kill us if you want to, but we're going to keep doing that. And the only way that you can get from Peter in the Gospel of Luke to Peter in the book of Acts is for Jesus to have physically, bodily been raised from the dead. Yep. That he's conquered death. The idea that you would get like in the early 20th century where they were trying to explain away the miracles, that Jesus was like, to use the language of the Princess Bride, that he was only mostly dead and had been dead all day. Right. Like that he was laying in the tomb, and in the cool of the tomb, he woke up and all of that nonsense, like a beaten, broken Jesus that didn't actually physically, bodily rise from the dead is not going to inspire that kind of proclamation. And his resurrected power, the fact that he is resurrected and now reigns at the right hand, in the way Luke says it in his gospel, is the right hand of the power of God, is that he's still reigning and ruling. His power is given to them, like he says in Acts 1:8. And as we get into the story of Acts, the world is turned upside down, not because of the power of these frail disciples, but because of the power of a risen king who's created a whole new world in his resurrection.
That's good. That's good. Let me zoom in a little bit. That's a great big 10,000 picture view of the passion. Let me ask you specifically. That was a great segue talking about Acts. One of the core pieces when we look at Scripture, we come to any text. One of the things we want to look at from an interpretive and standpoint is literary context. And you mentioned it, how each author, each gospel author has a particular vision, a particular audience, a particular angle. When we come to Luke, many people hopefully know, maybe they don't know that Luke Acts is a 2-volume narrative. But there is some debate about how much we allow the narrative and the structure of Acts to come into play when we interpret Luke. Could you talk about the relationship from an interpretive standpoint between Luke and Acts?
you have the thing that oftentimes you'll come into as you sort of look through both of the books is that there's not a single unifying one thing that ties the two together. There are lots of overlapping themes, like the sovereign rule of God in history, that all of this is unfolding according to God's plan, that you will see in Luke's gospel an emphasis on the inclusion of the Gentiles, that you see shades of it, allusions to it in the other gospels, like even in the Gospel of Matthew, where Matthew is by and large, it seems, writing to a Jewish audience that is going to have a framework and a concept of what messiahship is. The long story of the Bible, he begins with about the most Jewish thing you can think of in a genealogy, but that genealogy goes back to Abraham. Luke's going to have a genealogy, and his genealogy goes all the way back to Adam, which is one clue, along with a ton of others that we're going to see throughout the book, of allusions to and preparation for this mission to the Gentiles.
Yeah.
We see it even in this last week of Jesus' life. And you see it in the Gospel of John. You see it even in Matthew. When we get to the end, it's that you're making disciples of all the nations, not just of the Jews. And so part of the unfolding of the first part of the book of Acts is the recognition and realization of what that means in real world terms. Because when you think about it, the first 7 full chapters of the book of Acts, they're still in Jerusalem. They've been told Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, the ends of the earth, but they're there in Jerusalem, and it takes the death of Stephen and the persecution of Saul the Pharisee, who in some ways, I guess you could even say, is not just responsible for the Gentile mission, but the mission to the Samaritans, because he was chasing people and wanting to kill them. Right. So you've got that unfolding reality that God is in charge of this whole thing, that you have this closing of one story and the launching of a new story. But these two stories are interconnected. So like one of the things that I think is fascinating and would be great benefit to folks as you read yourselves in the Gospel of Luke and then into the book of Acts is to take advantage of the cross references that are in your Bible. Because even though Luke doesn't say it is written, or he says that regularly, he doesn't use the fulfillment language like Matthew does. Like Matthew says, like particularly in the first 2 chapters, you see it repeated over and over and over again. This took place to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet. Out of Egypt I call my son, or something like that. And Luke is going to use that fulfillment language. But one of the things that as you dig into the Gospel of Luke and as you sort of pay attention to those cross references, that, and honestly, there's times when you might even assume that your students, or I might even assume that you would know what those cross references are for. But the fact of the matter is, if somebody hasn't explained to you, so what these are trying to point out. Now, they're not inerrant. they're not like the scriptures themselves. There are going to be some that you're going to sort of turn your head like, oh, that's weird. That may not exactly work. But what they're trying to do is to help us see allusions to other places in the scripture. Sometimes they're pointing forward in the New Testament. Like if you're in the Gospels, maybe pointing forward to Paul, like they're trying to help us to see how this interconnects with something in one of the letters. But particularly as we see references and allusions, even beyond the direct quotations, and we see a lot of quotations even in the Gospel of Luke, that there are these allusions to the Old Testament where Luke is trying to make it really clear that this is the turning point of history. This is the center point in the story of the world. So you've got this Jewish story that is filled with problems. You've got this, you even see like in the interactions of Jesus with the Sadducees related to the resurrection, that he goes back and makes reference to the law, that even in the law, The Sadducees said that was the foundation for their lives. And as a result, they said that there was no such thing as the resurrection. Luke goes out of his way, though, to tell his readers who might not have known that they don't believe in the resurrection. That's really significant for the story that's about to happen. They're asking Jesus about something they don't even believe in.
Right.
And then Jesus turns the table and says, all right, you say that you base your whole life on the first 5 books. You think the rest of the Old Testament is scripture, but really you're going to draw and build your theology on this little part, the single part of the canon of the Old Testament. You're going to build your theology off that and say, in contrast to the Pharisees, that there is no resurrection. And he's saying, well, look at what is said there in Exodus when God says, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Like the fact that he makes reference to these long dead people says that death is not the end. And so then they ask this sort of illegitimate question about resurrection.
Mm-hmm.
And Jesus is like, no, he's not even going to deal with this. And so then at the heart of this turning of the story, this ending of a story of death and destruction in Israel. Like, Israel is called to be God's people. Israel is called in Genesis 12 and 15 with Abraham to be the one through whom all the peoples of the earth be blessed. But if you read the Old Testament, they're given this calling. The law then comes to regulate life. How is an unholy people going to live in the presence of a holy God? And that's why the law was given. The law didn't make Israel God's son. Like, as we read the Exodus narrative, in Exodus 4, you get the whole of the Exodus narrative foreshadowed because Israel is God's son. He's chosen them. There's people. The law is given to regulate life so that this God who comes on the mountain with fire and their boundaries so that people are not destroyed, he wants to be near to his people, but their sinfulness and his holiness don't combine. And so in the unfolding of the story, you have the law to regulate life, but in Deuteronomy, we get to chapter 30, after having sort of outlined the blessings and the curses as they enter the land, in chapter 30, verse 6, Moses goes out of his way to say, like, you're going to be scattered in verses 1 through 5. You're going to be scattered to the ends of the earth. You're going to be destroyed because you're going to know all the curses. You're going to know the blessing of living in the land for a time, but you're going to know all the curses. The thing that God said to Abraham about the sin of the Amorites is not yet complete. That's why you're going to have this period. You're not ever going to have the land that I've promised. Well, the same land that's going to vomit out, this is the language in Leviticus, it's very graphic, is going to vomit out the pagans, will vomit you out too if you become pagans.
And that's the story
practices.
And that's the story, to your point, that's the story that Jesus is walking into, right?
That's exactly right.
The Sadducees, the Pharisees, they're living in the light of, they're under the
that's
pagan
exactly
rule.
Right.
Yeah.
So one of the things that's difficult in a fashion in walking into the Gospels is you've got really two things going on at the same time. You've got the historical reality of what's happening in the first century, and then you have what the Gospel writer is doing to shape that, to teach something and apply it to his readers. And I think that should be really instructive to us, even as we talk about these matters, is that from the very beginning, as the story was first being retold orally and then being written down, it's just the same thing as what we're doing today. We're just explaining what they were explaining to another group of people. Mm-hmm. That from the get-go, this was a story of Jesus that was completing the story of Israel. And one of the things that I think we can see in Luke is he's making it really clear that Jesus is the Jewish Messiah. As the king, this is King of the Jews language is used in each of the Gospels, but as the king, he is the representative of the people. And as the king, he can stand in the place of the people. He's the representative of the nation. So like to the people of the world, in a way, the president of the United States is the representative of who the United States is or what the United States represents to the whole world. Now, we can argue about it at any given time, regardless of who the president is, how much that's an accurate presentation of reality. But that's the perception. In the case of Jesus, he is the reality. He is the true Israelite.
Because that's covenant language in the old covenant. The king, in a covenantal relationship, the king represents, even in non-Jewish world, the king represented nations and covenants. And so as we get into this new covenant reality, Jesus represents the covenant. He's inaugurating a new covenant.
And you'll see, like in the telling of the birth of Jesus, this sort of echoing of David's story in various ways, that, this idea in chapters 1 and 2 in particular, and certainly leading up to the birth of Jesus, as you see this interaction between Elizabeth and Mary, and what's told to Mary, and then what's told even to the shepherds, is that there is this sort of underlying current of 2 Samuel 7 that's being fulfilled. Like, we've been looking for, John will bring this out significantly, I think, this prophet like Moses, whom the people will actually listen to. So think about the language of my sheep hear my voice, and I call them by name and they listen to me. Like, I think that there are some echoes of Deuteronomy that start to come up and out of the page of, like, the true Israel is going to listen to this one like Moses, who's greater than Moses. So like in the festivals that are there, starting in chapter 5, I think, with Sabbath, and you go into Passover in chapter 6, and then you have the Feast of Tabernacles in 7 and on into 8. Like, you've got this reality where Jesus is all of the story of Israel that's told in the feasts, recounting, the Sabbath to keep it holy, then Passover, and then which obviously we're going to see here in Luke as well in this last week of Jesus' life, and then into the Feast of Tabernacles, which by the time of Jesus' life had become associated with their wandering in the wilderness, and they light up the temple, burning in the oil lamps the soiled garments of the priests from the last year. Like, you've got this, like, the temple sits there as the light of the world. This is the place where God reigns and rules in the midst of his people. And Jesus is, no, I'm the light of the world.
Right.
This is a representation. I am the real thing.
Would you say, I think for people to really, I think sometimes people, they struggle to really understand the conflict. Why are the Jewish leaders so annoyed at first, and then they see Jesus as a threat? I think for people to really understand that when Jesus was saying that his program for the kingdom is it, he's saying that everybody else's program is not it. And I think when you talk about this, when you talk about this identity of the true Israel, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, the Zealots, they all had their own vision for how God was going to bring the kingdom. Yeah, and so I think for people to really understand that hasn't changed, that the kingdom is still trying to be taken by violence in a lot of ways, and it's our endeavor to get back to Jesus' program for the kingdom.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really an important thing to recognize, is that there's a spiritual dimension to what's going on historically in the first century, for sure. There is a political dimension that's going on to this. So like in John's gospel, they say that if we let Jesus, after the raising of Lazarus, if we let Jesus keep going on from doing these kinds of things, all the people are going to follow after him, and we're going to lose our title, essentially, and our authority. And that's something we can't bear. And so there are personal animosities, there are theological animosities, because the Pharisees believe the kingdom is going to come in a particular way. They're looking for God to intervene. They, like Saul the Pharisee, they're trying to push Israel to practical obedience to the law. Like their goal is laudable in a sense. Like they recognize in the unfolding of the story that Israel got into the mess that they're in of exile. And I would contend, and I think you can see it in the Gospel of Luke, that they're in this protracted exile, even in the first century. Like with the return of Ezra and Nehemiah, I think you can make a really strong case that even though they're in the land, the things the prophets said, the pre-exilic and exilic prophets, and really even post-exilic prophets, the things that they're saying about God returning to his people, about the giving of the Spirit, the forgiveness of sins, these are all sort of interwoven together. And then you go in Ezra and Nehemiah and you realize that when they go back, this is one of the things the prophet said, there's going to be a streaming of people from all over the world back to Jerusalem to worship the one true and living God. That would include the Gentiles. Now, in the Pharisees' view, it was sort of at the point of a sword, kind of coming back to Jerusalem. But you have this streaming back, this giving of the Spirit, this reigning and ruling of God from Temple Mount. And they rebuild the temple. They repent of their sins. They dedicate this temple. And the folks that had seen the Davidic temple or Solomonic temple,
they're crying.
They're crying because it's just a shadow of what it had formerly been. And then when they dedicate it, the glory of God doesn't fall like it did in the days of Solomon.
That's exactly
the Spirit is not there. And, and Ezekiel makes it really clear, the glory of God's left.
That's right.
Like in Jeremiah, they're saying, Temple Lord, Temple Lord. Well, yeah, there's a building there, but God's left. Yeah. And Ezekiel makes that really clear, that the glory of God leaves. And so in Ezra and Nehemiah's day, the glory of God doesn't return, and they're talking about this repentance, and they're still celebrating. Like, we can't miss the celebrating part, but there's kind of this angst and
there's a tension there.
Just sort of, there's a tension of, we're living here, but except for the period of the Maccabees, they're under the thumb of the Romans. And even then you wonder, like, were they just like, were the external powers just ignoring them at this particular point in time? After the fall of Alexander the Great's empire, you've got all of this angst, and then Herod steps in, he builds this temple thinking that it's going to, get all kinds of sort of public support for him. You have this now wonder of the ancient Near Eastern world.
Right.
In fact, I can actually use it as my Zoom background. I actually have it in there. That you've got this wonder of the ancient Near Eastern world, but yet when he comes out, the people throw fruit at him, right? Because he's taxed them to death to pay for it. So you've got this wonder of the world, but at the same time, it's the glory of God still not fallen. The temple leadership, the Sadducees they're the status quo. Like they're the Pharisees, they're wanting to bring change from within. They're working with these enemies. And that's sort of where you see this enemy of my enemy is my friend come in with the Pharisees and Sadducees in the last week of Jesus' life. And you've got the Essenes who've sort of withdrawn. They're believing God's going to intervene and throw over the corrupt people. The Sadducees would be sort of the political elite of Jerusalem. If you wanted to put it sort of in modern terms, the Pharisees were trying to drain the swamp from within. The Essenes were hoping that God would just zap them all. And then you have this sort of underlying revolutionary current that's there, that they want to fight.
They're the malicious. They're the malicious of today. Yeah,
that's right. And I think in the end, what we'll see is that Jesus dies sort of he dies not sort of as a political revolutionary, even though it's clear to everyone that's looking at it honestly.
Yeah, and Dr. Mathis, I really want to pull on that thread. I want to pull on that thread in just a second. I want to get there with Barabbas particularly, because I think I'm no Greek scholar. I learned from you actually. But I will say that I think Luke uses a very specific word for Barabbas.
Yes.
But Luke uses that. So let's jump in here. You're talking about the temple. For a lot of people, when we see Jesus this is in Luke, I think Luke 21, I believe.
Okay.
Is where he visits the temple. Is that right? Luke 20 or 20?
Yeah. As I was reading over this, like I read through this this morning just to prep, I was really struck by how in comparison to Matthew and Luke, when Jesus enters, there's a bit more discussion of his visit to the temple, Luke keeps that pretty short. Initially, he's going to come back around to some of those themes a bit later on, but I found it really striking what he does emphasize, and even in that. So where in 21 are you talking about?
I'm sorry, I'm in the end of 19. I was mistaken.
Okay, end of 19. Okay.
Yeah.
Got it.
So you were just talking about, I think this is significant for people just to get a framework for understanding how the Jewish story is coming to an end, and how this what I would call the Jesus story, the new age, is breaking in. When we talk about Jesus entering the temple, some Bible headings say, and even mine here says, that Jesus cleansed the temple. What you're saying, though, that's not a good description, right? Of what he's actually
not
doing.
at all. So let's talk about that a little bit. So when Jesus comes to the temple, and this is a bit more explained. In fact, let's look at it in the Gospel of Luke, starting like in verse 41. When he drew near and saw the city, he wept over it. This is unique to Luke, saying, "Would that even you had known on this day the things that make for peace." So keep that word peace in mind as we look at this, and as you read through this last week of Jesus' life on your own, that word peace is going to appear in various places, and I think it's really important to keep in mind not just sort of the theological ramifications of that, but also sort of the historical and political ones too. But now they are hidden from your eyes. So there's a tumult coming. There is war on the horizon. He's going to talk about this in a little bit later on. But now they are hidden from your eyes. So the way for peace is closed to you. And he's talking about himself ultimately. And then we get this sort of prelude to what's going to be discussed later on in the week, in a bit later. So I can't remember the reference off the top of my head. So anyway, so for the days will come upon you when your armies will set up a barricade around you, surround you, and hem you in on every side, and tear you down to the ground, you and your children within you, and they will not leave one stone upon another in you. This is getting to the destruction of the temple later on, because you did not know the time of your visitation. So
talk about that. Luke, talk about visitation there. You maybe where you were going to, but I really want you to hit that.
This time of your visitation is this, like the cross-reference in my Bible is saying the time of your visitation could be a reference back to Daniel 9. So what you have here, I think, and this is certainly something that folks can dispute and disagree with, but I think what you're having is Jesus comes to Jerusalem, fulfilling very clearly Zechariah 9,
right,
where Zechariah talks about that the king will ride in on the back of a donkey, humble and mounted on a donkey. And you have this in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and I think John also will make reference to it as well, that you have Jesus riding into Jerusalem as a king. He explicitly prepares the way for this entry. He is like, this is planned out. This is public theater.
It's very different to what,
think
it's
about
very different than what he was doing previously. That's why this is so interesting, is that he was so, especially in Mark, we get the Messianic secret of where he's been very aloof. Yeah. He's been withdrawing back into Galilee, away from Jerusalem. Right. And here he kind of sets his face, as Luke says. And I want
Luke goes out of his way to say that.
Out of his way to say it. And it's this visitation, as you're saying, is very intentional.
Yeah. So then what happens in Zechariah is you read Zechariah, chapter 9 is really difficult to sort through. Like, it's kind of apocalyptic. Mm-hmm. It's got this really strange language, this sort of end of the world language that the prophets use a lot to describe things that are not the end of the world, which I think is really important for us to recognize, that a lot of times is sort of, and you'll see it even here in Luke, that Jesus is going to talk about like the sun and the moon and all these things. This is not exactly describing, it could, in various places it does describe the end of the world, but on other occasions it's describing things that are happening in the middle of history to show that God is intervening directly. Right. So like in Isaiah 13 uses this kind of a classic demonstration of this end of the world language is used, but he's describing the fall of Babylon, which has already happened.
Yeah,
So he's using this
that's right.
end of the world language to describe the fall of Babylon, to show that Babylon is not going to fall because the Medes and the Persians arise. Babylon is falling because God is destroying them.
Mm-hmm.
That he's the sovereign king of everything. So when you see, like in Acts 2, Peter's going to make reference to Joel, and he's going to use that same end of the world language. Well, what he's saying there is, and I think that Peter is making it very clear that Joel is being fulfilled right then and there.
Right there. Not in the future, but right
when
there.
the coming of the Spirit is the sign of the arrival of God's kingdom, the arrival of the new age, the launching of this new mission that has been inaugurated in the death and resurrection of Jesus, that he uses that end of the world language because he's saying God is here, and we see it quite literally. God is here in the person of the Holy Spirit. So
it's Zechariah 9 is the same thing.
Yeah, and so Zechariah 9, what starts to happen is that there's this very odd dance that's happening where it becomes unclear at points where the description is about God himself and where the description is about the king. And so it becomes a great place for Jesus to embody what he's doing, because when it becomes unclear, is this talking about the king? Is this talking about God? It elaborates on something that was really important in the first century that John really exploits, is that the mantra of the Jewish people in the first century was, we have no king but God. And at the end of the story in John, as he's being betrayed, as Jesus is being betrayed by the Sadducees and Pharisees, they're going to make this explicit declaration, we have no king but Caesar, which gets to the heart of the matter.
It does.
And so here with this time of visitation, I do think Matthew and Luke maybe bring it out in a different way, and maybe a little more explicitly in terms of his arrival at the temple, is that this time of the visitation is that God has come to you in the person of the king. The glory of God that departed from the temple is returning in the incarnate Son of God, who is described in many ways in the New Testament as the glory of God. That he is coming, God has returned to save his people, to redeem his people, to end their exile, to forgive their sins, and you've missed it.
Yes, that's right.
You've just flat missed it. And so now the way of peace to God, the way of peace in the world, that's taken from you. You're going to face God's judgment because of what you've done to the one he sent, the best loved, beloved son. We're going to see that in the parable later on. And you've missed the time of your visitation. Essentially, I am the way that makes for peace. You've missed it. Judgment is coming, which then leads into, in the way Luke tells it, in a very truncated way, verse 45, and he entered the temple and began to drive out those who sold, saying to them, it is written, my house shall be a house of prayer, but you've made it a den of, and then almost all of our translations say robbers.
Yeah, talk about that, please.
So this leads into the Barabbas thing you were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
So my house shall be a house of prayer. It's kind of interesting, honestly, that some of the other gospels will say for all the nations, because that's in the original quotation. Luke oddly leaves it out. And we don't have the longer explanation of the story. It's really short. He doesn't talk about how the people would use the temple as a shortcut. Like you can see in the background behind me, it sort of sits in the middle of town, and people would come in there in the I guess to my left, the opposite of my left hand. So the way you're seeing it to my right. And they would come in there, they would go out the other side to get across town without having to walk around the outside wall. So using it as a shortcut, profaning it by, Mark says, both the buying and the selling and the trading of the money, because they wouldn't let the people use their regular coins in the temple. They would use Tyrian silver coins because they didn't have images on them. And also because the Romans were kind of notorious for shaving weight off of the coins, because the amount that the coins were worth was in the weight of the material. So, there are all kinds of sort of things going on there, but then you get to this den of robbers. And this is the thing that I think is really, really important. That word there, the Greek word is leistes, can be translated in about three different ways. It can be translated as robber, like it is in most of our translations. It can be translated as I'm looking at it, as a bandit. And then the last one is as an insurrectionist. And I think that's really important, sort of paving the way for what we see with Barabbas.
I agree.
Is that the thing we have to ask ourselves the question of is, would the Roman law, would the Roman government send to their death on a cross? Like the Roman writer Cicero said that crucifixion is so horrible, so awful that it should be removed from the eyes and ears of every Roman. Like, this is not something we even need to think about. That's how gruesome and awful this is. So would the Romans send to death on a cross, even with what's going on with the religious leaders, someone who was just essentially accused of petty theft? Some type of robbery? And the answer to that is no. I mean, the Romans are going to send folks to death, particularly death on the cross, the least humane way they could put someone to death, if you can even talk about it in those terms, to give this agonizing, mocking, I would use the term again, public theater, to show this is, I think gets to the point, is they've made it into a place of revolution, a place of insurrection. So it was shocking to me when I was in seminary to learn that in the 100 years before and the 100 years after, so that 200-year time frame with the life of Jesus in the middle, from Josephus, I think is the main source, that there were 18 folks that, roughly, give or take, that came to Jerusalem, claimed to be the Messiah, brought with them an army of sorts, and tried to bring in God's kingdom by force.
Right.
And all of them, without fail, were killed. And
all of them used the temple as a symbol.
And that is the launching pad. So if you look in the picture here, in fact, I did it kind of as a joke, but it actually can be helpful for us. Let me flip it a little bit so I can point to the picture a little better. Sorry about that.
That's all right.
Let's see here. So now I've kind of mirrored it in there, and I can point to it a little better, I think. If you look on this left-hand side, on the corner, you can see in the back, right back there, in the back. So if you're looking at it with my left hand, like right where my hand is there in that corner, there's a fortress of Antonia is there. It's been built up in the days of Herod. It's built there. And so what the Romans are using it for at this point is to have eyes and ears on the temple. So if you think about what happens in the book of Acts. So in the book of Acts, when Paul is in the temple, I think chapter 20, he's accused of bringing a Gentile from Ephesus. They've seen him walking around out in town with the guy from Ephesus. He's accused of bringing him into that area of the temple right there that I just moved out of the way of, where only Jews can go. And it creates a riot. They're beating Paul. And you can see how quick they are to get in the temple. And a few years before this, Pilate, in a pretty foolish move, he brought Roman soldiers into the temple grounds, into this court of the Gentiles, the larger area that's around sort of where my head is. He brought them in there, and they came in with Roman banners, which have symbols of the gods on them. So this caused great uproar because insurrection is starting in the temple. So if you come to Jerusalem and you want to start a revolution, you're going to start it right here. So they want to always have eyes on it, to see what's going on, to keep their eyes on it. And so that also, by the way, should remind us that when we read about Palm Sunday and they're coming into town, they're watching. They're watching as Jesus makes his way up to the temple. And it sort of, I think, puts in a better historical perspective kind of the size of the crowd. This wouldn't have been kind of the massive throng, at least that I imagined it to be when I was growing up, that then leads to sort of the consternation about, well, how did all of these people who were walking him into Jerusalem then turn on him at the end?
Right.
The reality is this was probably, 50 to 100 people with him that were lauding him as king, rather than the throng of thousands that at least I envisioned as a kid, which then leads to, well, it's probably a different group of people that you've got saying crucify him on Friday, as opposed to the ones that are lauding him on Sunday. So they're saying you're the king. They're leading him into the temple. He goes in the temple. He offers himself to them as the king, and nobody recognizes. And so Luke doesn't tell us the story of the cursing of the fig tree. He gets to the point in a little bit of a different way. Mm-hmm. But with the cursing of the fig tree, with what we have here in his lament over Jerusalem that we read in 41 to 44 of chapter 19, is that what he's doing is he's cursing this place.
That's right.
What happens to the fig tree is going to happen to the temple. It's going to be destroyed. And this kind of reaches a crescendo in Acts. You sort of see the overlapping with Stephen. Like he says, you've made this building into an idol. You've made this building into a visible representation of God rather than seeing God himself. Mm. So you're just as much an idolater as the Romans. Mm-hmm. It's just your idol is different. And I think it kind of reveals, honestly, what I think it was Calvin that said that the human heart is an idol factory. Like we're going to make idols of. The key thing is for us to recognize what those idols are and to recognize that Jesus alone can be king.